Welcome back, Doubts Aloud listeners. And as promised, we're here. We're with a bonus episode. And for you, we've got a guest speaker, as I had said on the last podcast. Actually, Ed, I just want to put something to you and Francis. Do you know how many listeners we have?
No, I've no idea.
No. Well, I don't either. But because we're based on reason and evidence, I have evidence of definitely one listener, and he's here on the line. It's Mathew Hartke.
Here I am.
Yeah. So what better evidence than that? We actually have someone from across the pond. Okay. So on the line from the US, we have Mathew Hartke. That's how you say it, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Now, I first heard Mathew on The Unbelievable Show, a show which, as you know by now, has a lot to do with this show and or with this podcast. And that was on The Unbelievable Show on the subject of Jesus as the failed apocalyptic prophet. And episode 4 of Doubts Aloud goes into that in detail, so check that out. So, Mathew, I'd just like to ask you that going from that subject into many other subjects, can you just sort of explain your journey to doubt and your stage of doubt, and then how it led to the issue of really knowing so much about the resurrection?
Yeah. Well, I explained part of my journey on that Unbelievable episode, so I'll try not to retread too much of the same ground. But I mean, in that episode, talking about Jesus being a failed apocalyptic prophet. That was definitely a big issue. Eschatology in general was a big part of my journey, a big focus, and so the more I delved into that subject, the more that became an issue. In addition to that, there was the problem of evil was something that I increasingly felt like I couldn't avoid. And the problem of divine hiddenness was also something that I felt very, very, very personally. All of those, though, I felt like I could kind of plug those holes. It felt like I had, like I was in a boat and there was these little holes in the boat, and I could plug this hole, I could plug that hole. I went into the Old Testament, and I was like, okay, I can kind of get by with a non-literal reading of Genesis. It doesn't really matter if the Exodus happened or not. That's okay. Myth, legend there, that's fine. But the more the questions kind of came into the New Testament, the more the questions kind of started to focus on Jesus. Kind of the last stand that I had was with the resurrection. And as long as everything else could fall, and I was like, I can still consider myself a Christian. I can still hold on to this, as long as I can still believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But unfortunately, it just or fortunately, I mean, at the time it felt unfortunate. At the time it was a really difficult thing to go through. Losing faith, and as I'm sure we all know, in retrospect, it's been an amazing journey. But I had read N.T. Wright's really his big 700-page book on the resurrection, and I found that really convincing for a number of years. But the more I read, the more I studied, the more I realized that he brings a really compelling case if you only really read his argument. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that actually there are a lot of holes here. And he spends 700 or about 600 pages arguing for the Jewish understanding of resurrection, and the appearances of Jesus and the empty tomb, that the disciples, that they believed they saw Jesus, and that the tomb was found empty. And then he kind of poses that question, and he's like, well, how can we explain this? The only answer, the only possible answer, the only plausible answer is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And I kind of closed the book, and I was like, well, hold on. That seems to be the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I can imagine quite a few alternative theories that could explain those two phenomenon, the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus, or the disciples, at least their belief that they had seen Jesus alive from the dead. And that question just nagged at me for about 3 years. And I just kept trying to, initially I kept, trying to find literature that would help shore up my faith. And so read like Mike Lacona's big book on the resurrection, Gary Habermas, William Lane Craig, everything that I could get my hands on. But the more I read apologists, the more I actually found that, like, these guys aren't answering my questions. And they seem to me to be just lacking historical creativity, just kind of positing the supernatural event of God raising Jesus from the dead as the only possible scenario, and then kind of arguing against these straw men of, like, the swoon theory, or a caricature of, like, the hallucination theory, or things like that from what I've seen, skeptical scholarship has actually progressed a long way since those kind of 19th century solutions, or skeptical answers, and I just wasn't seeing any of the conservative scholars or apologists really deal with those questions, and so that's how it really started for me.
Okay, that is a terrific summary, Matthew. And Ed and Francis have to say that I've followed sort of Matthew on his Facebook, and I have to say that I've said this to Matthew, so he's heard this before, but I really don't need to say or write anything on Facebook, because Matthew writes what I would write, except better. Actually writes better.
That's too
kind.
And
so, because at so many points, it's like, that's exactly what I think in these similar areas, particularly when it was on the Praetorist and other stuff as well. I came to look at the resurrection at the very end of my journey to think, okay, if it didn't happen, what could have happened? Rather than, it's like, what could have been the reality if it's not real? And so that was my stance in looking at it. So it's maybe slightly different than your journey. But Ed, or Francis, do you want to just comment on what Matthew has said there in this lead up to the subject?
When I come across Christians or apologists or anything, the resurrection really does seem to be the bedrock. When you talk about suffering or things not making sense, they go back and say, well, I know it's real because of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. And the life of Jesus is the kind of the stories we have about him. The death is hardly divine or special. He was crucified. A lot of people have been, apparently. And so really it's the resurrection that is the kind of foundation of it all. And I'm not sure how carefully people consider the alternative explanations, because what we're not explaining other ways of explaining an empty tomb and a Jesus appearing in a room and eating fish. We're explaining the data we have that's been handed down to us from the first century.
Yes, it's I suppose I never thought about it as that particularly compelling. When my lack of belief disappeared, it more disappeared in terms of my belief in God, and when my belief in God went, then everything else just followed all in one lump, as it were. It wasn't that I picked out that there's strong evidence for the resurrection, and if there's strong evidence for the resurrection, then Jesus must have been a divine person. It didn't work like that for me. My belief in God went, that was foundational, everything else disappeared in a puff of smoke.
Well, okay, then, Matthew, maybe the best way to sort of proceed in this is just to sort of say, okay, coming to it like you did, you sort of turned to it, I turned to it. What was some of the strikingly... were you surprised when you looked at it that it didn't hold up? Was it a real shock?
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, one of the first, probably the first question, it was more just an intuition that I had, but it was just an awareness of kind of the intrinsic oddity, and kind of this feeling of unnaturalness in the resurrection narratives, the way that Jesus kind of appears and disappears, how short his exhortations are, how short his words of comfort are. So just the kind of the eerie feeling of the resurrection narratives in contrast with the rest of the gospel narratives, about Jesus's life. It just has a very kind of otherworldly, kind of tacked on artificial feeling to it. And then the question of like, where did Jesus go afterwards? And if he's risen, where is he now? And the way that Luke's narrative kind of answers that question in Luke and in Acts with his story of the ascension. And I couldn't help like reading that and feeling just the close similarity between the narrative of the Luke's narrative of the ascension and the story of Mormonism, and the way that you have the golden tablets that Joseph Smith receives, and he translates the golden tablets to produce the Book of Mormon, and then he shows the golden tablets to the 8 witnesses and to the 3 witnesses, and they all verify, like, we saw these golden tablets, and they give their testimonies. But then the question is where are the tablets now? And the very convenient, explanation that's given by the Mormon Church is that, well, the angel Moroni came back and took the tablets back up to heaven after Joseph Smith wrote them, and so it's this weird, like, okay, so we're in this position where we just have to trust these eyewitnesses, and there are these eyewitnesses, and in that sense, I mean, because it's so much more recent than obviously the records that we have about the beginning of Christianity. There's so much more to go on, but we're really just kind of at the mercy of whether or not we believe these witnesses or not. And that to me was just, I wouldn't accept that for Mormonism. That wouldn't be compelling to me. But why would I accept that? Why would that be compelling with something that we have so much less data on, and that is so much more removed from the eyewitnesses, which is the New Testament accounts of the resurrection. And so those were some of the big questions that initially kind of just, as kind of an intuition pressed on me. And I was like, I just don't feel like that's something that I can rest this, it felt like a very, very fragile foundation that I was resting this huge edifice on top of. And I was just like, I just don't feel like that holds. I don't think that I can actually rest a whole worldview on that tenuous of a foundation.
That's really
really
fascinating.
like
I liked Richard Carrier's sort of quote in this area where he said, wouldn't it have been more convincing for Jesus to have been ascended in front of the Roman Senate? Or at least the whole Sanhedrin, but not 12 or a few more outside in Bethany, which is a bit closer to the idea of the tablets in Mormonism. It's like there's a similar number of witnesses, and how convenient to go back to heaven. Same with Jesus. Once Luke has talked about Jesus as flesh and bone for all his reasons for doing that, you think you've got to get that flesh and bone off the planet, or otherwise he's going to be hiding out somewhere.
That's an interesting analogy, actually, because in the Gospel of Peter, which is a early to mid 2nd century gospel, non-canonical gospel, it in its kind of narrative of the resurrection, it's not just women coming to the tomb and finding it empty, and then being told, oh, he's he'll meet you in Galilee, or go and tell the disciples and he'll meet them there. It's not these kind of private appearances to the women or the disciples. Instead, there's not just 2 guards at the tomb like there is in Matthew's narrative, but there's actually a centurion and his whole troop of soldiers. So, I mean, 100 Roman soldiers at the tomb, plus the scribes and the elders of Jerusalem. And it says a great multitude from around Jerusalem, all waiting at the tomb when the resurrection happens. The stone rolls away, and not just Jesus, but Jesus and 2 angels come out of the tomb, and Jesus, it says, his head reaches up to heaven, and the cross is floating behind him,
and it speaks, I believe,
and it speaks. There's a voice from heaven that comes. Have you preached to those that sleep? And the cross says, "Yea." And then that, it's just so public, and it's very much like Richard Carrier's story. But what's interesting about that is that scholars, liberal or conservative, it doesn't matter. Nobody would hesitate to say that the Gospel of Peter's narrative of the resurrection is filled with legendary accretions, all of these elements that are obviously based on elements from the earlier Gospels. So you have Matthew's Roman guards at the tomb, you have Luke's 2 angels, and little details like that, but they've grown, all out of proportion. And that very much cuts against the popular kind of apologetic defense of the kind of reliability of the Gospels that says, well, legends take so much time to develop. They take hundreds of years to develop usually. So the Gospels are written so close to the events that they couldn't possibly have legendary accretions. But I mean, the distance in time between the Gospel of Peter, the agreed upon date of the Gospel of Peter, early 2nd century to mid 2nd century, it stands in about
20 years after John.
Yeah, exactly. It stands in about the same relationship to the canonical Gospels, that the canonical Gospels stand in relation to the events that they claim to record. So if there's obviously so much legendary development with this non-canonical source that nobody has a vested interest in trying to defend the historicity of, then by what rationale of dating or argument about how legends usually develop, by what argument of that nature can we then stand and say there couldn't possibly be legendary development in the canonical resurrection narratives? And once you recognize that point and you go back and you can actually see a pretty clear trajectory of legendary development where, the earliest source, Mark, doesn't really have a resurrection narrative. He doesn't, after the empty tomb, it just kind of, that's it. That's the end. The women run away and they're afraid and they say nothing to anyone. And then Matthew changes that, and he has them, instead of running away afraid and not telling anyone, he says that they went away with great joy, and they went and told the disciples, and then Jesus appears to them in Galilee, and then Luke comes along and he's like, well, let's change that. It's not Galilee, it's Jerusalem. And he doesn't tell them, go and I'll meet you in Galilee. He says, remember when he was in Galilee and he told you he would meet you in Jerusalem. And you just see these elements that get changed, get redacted from one gospel to the next. And you can see actually a very clear, when you realize the dating of the Gospels relative to one another and how they were dependent upon the earlier sources, Matthew and Luke being dependent on Mark, and once you read them in relationship to one another, you can actually see a pretty clear trajectory of legendary development, and that's the evidence. So.
And Mark has the resurrection as the most private event you can imagine. Mm-hmm. If you compare the beginning of Mark, and Mark, just in case Matthew here, not St. Matthew, but our Matthew on the podcast, was saying how Mark was the first, before all the legendary accretion was added to it, and we don't know how much legend there is prior to Mark, but that's the earliest we've got. So Mark is a really useful place to start. And Mark has Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and there Jesus is very out in your face in terms of his miracles. People saying, who is this person? Even the spirits obey him. What's happening among us? Who is this man? There's loads of public. The whole of Galilee is astir with Jesus' ministry. beginning of Mark, and then at the end of Mark, you have this incredibly private event. You've got women go to a tomb, meet a man there who other gospel writers seem to think is angels, and saying, look, the tomb is empty, and go and tell the disciples. And the women, if you treat it as the text says, the women ran off afraid and didn't tell anyone. They didn't even tell the disciples. And then there's no a stir in Jerusalem. No one comes to check the tomb. It's all completely private and just amongst these few people. As it goes on with the other Gospels, it gets slightly more public, but still there's no authorities coming to check the empty tomb and anything like that. The nearest you get is the guard story in Matthew, which scholars dismiss pretty quickly as invented apologetic.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to add to that you can bet you that if the Gospel of Peter was in the Bible, they completely would defend it. Do you know what I mean? It's ridiculous, and I know how they would do it as well. But they would defend it. So they wouldn't. But what really puzzles me is how everybody would accept that Christian writers could make up stuff, embellish stuff, add stuff, say they're somebody who they're not, i.e. Peter. Christian people can do this, but suddenly all of that goes out the window, and they can't do it in the Gospels, as in the Gospel of Mark, whoever wrote it, Matthew, whoever wrote it. And by the way, Ed,
you have to find a way to
by the way,
harmonize it.
There's no theme going on here, but our first guest speaker was John. Now we've got Matthew. So watch out for Luke and Mark. Ed, do you know any? How about that for
let's try and find Luke Galen.
Yeah. Yes, excellent.
There you go, Luke Galen.
That was just Mark talk about it. Yeah, no undesigned coincidences here.
So,
anyway, Francis.
Andrew, you were saying that they defend it, and I'm guessing the harmonisation would follow the same pattern that the harmonisation follows for the discrepancies between the other Gospels. They'd say, well, nobody said there wasn't a cross.
Yeah.
Matthew didn't mention a cross, but it was just like, he didn't say there wasn't a cross. So if Peter says a cross came out, there's no reason for us to disbelieve it. There's no reason. Nobody said that the scribes weren't there. Nobody says the centurion wasn't there. I mean, it's just this idea that, were there two angels? Were there 693 and they just forgot to mention the other 691?
Right.
I mean, it's just...
Mark just pointed out one young man who was standing in front of a whole army, So that's right.
Yes, that's right. Yes. That was one important
that's an
young man.
One young man
but,
there. One of many, I must add. But you can see from a sceptical point of view how silly that is. But I can see Matthew's point in, obviously, Mark, and Ed makes this quite clearly as well, this idea that Matthew really does, with the zombie walkabout, as I call it, the other elements of the earthquake, and it just has that sort of feel. Matthew has the feel... Sorry, the Gospel of Peter has the feel to Matthew as Matthew does to Mark. Do you see what I mean? Same kind of, I wish he hadn't said that or done that or gone so extreme, which means apologists have a hard time making it all historical. And Mike Licona loses his job over it,
Exactly.
So...
And he was, and I mean, Mike Licona's explanation for if you read in his book on the resurrection where he talks about that zombie apocalypse passage, he only offers, he talks about it as being possibly a literary device that is drawing on apocalyptic motifs, and very much in kind of an anti-right way of investing this story with kind of its theological significance. But he treads so lightly, and he uses the phrase that it is a literary device, which kind of sounds kind of like a euphemism for legendary development. But he doesn't. He's very careful to try and say that this is something that people would have understood as a genre thing, as like a they wouldn't have taken it literally. But of course, you know, he loses his job even when he's saying something that is so mild and so like treading so carefully and trying not to say the words like legendary development. And he only offers it as a possibility, like maybe this is an explanation. And if that's the case for someone like, you know, Mike Licona, then how many other conservative scholars are you know, afraid to lose their jobs and are held, you know, are beholden to kind of the party lines of
I think we've established that this approach of using the Gospels as eyewitness testimony for the resurrection, and therefore we can know with confidence that the resurrection happened, that really is a non-starter. And even Justin in his book Unbelievable doesn't go there. So I think it'd be great for us to, since our show is so kind of in respect of Unbelievable and Justin, to start with how Justin does present what he feels is a solid argument for the resurrection having happened. Matthew, what did you make of Justin's chapter in his book on the resurrection?
I thought Justin did a really good job of summarizing the minimal facts approach that you see, you know, it kind of in more detail in the works of Gary Habermas and in the joint book between Habermas and Licona. You know, I think, and I read, you know, your part of your response to Justin in your guys' response book, and I take a very similar approach to you, and actually in your kind of appraisal of the minimal facts, I had the same exact questions that you did, where for the most part, I could accept the minimal facts, I could accept all of them, and I would still come out with the same skeptical questions that I would that I do that would still make it to me seem like a more plausible explanation. A naturalist explanation would be more plausible than resurrection, but the empty tomb, you know.
Let's go down these lists of minimal facts, because not everybody would have heard all this stuff. From memory, the first one is that the crucifixion really did happen and Jesus really did die. He didn't sort of swoon and recover in the tomb or anything like that. And the point of these minimal facts is that Justin or Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, whom he is leaning on to a degree, will say, okay, let's just have as a basis what the scholars, even on the sceptical side, will agree with. And scholars on the sceptical side definitely do agree that Jesus was effectively and comprehensively killed through crucifixion because the Romans were doing a good job, and that's just solid. So that's fact one, and so it gives a sort of flavour for what we're going for. Fact two, I think, was the empty tomb. Fact three was that Jesus appeared to the disciples. And in particular, he picked, I think this is a separate minimal fact, that some of these were initially sceptical, and he uses James, who was the brother of Jesus, and in the early part of the Gospels, there's a story of James being very dismissive of Jesus, and we see later on that he becomes quite a leading light in the church. And then the Apostle Paul is someone who, through his Damascus Road experience, converts. So that is someone else who's sceptical, who gets convinced by appearances. And then the birth of the early church only makes sense through the resurrection. So I think those are the 5 facts. I've got problems with
all of them.
Some more than others. No, I'm happy with the crucifixion is clear.
Yeah.
The appearances are clear. So Matthew, I'll talk about the appearances, and then you jump in and say if you think there is anything wrong with what I'm saying. The point is, and Gary Habermas sort of picked this up so well, Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 what we understand to be a creed. maybe it's a hymn, but it feels like a creed that summarises the gospel. And this gospel says how Jesus died, was buried and rose again, and he appeared to first Peter, and then the 12, and then this, that, and the other, and 500 mentioned, and last of all to Paul himself. Now, the creedy bit looks like it finishes after the appearances to the 12. And Paul also, in his other letter to Galatians, which is full of dirty laundry and not the sort of thing that would be made up from nothing, does talk about him meeting and even having arguments with Peter and James, this James who's the brother of Jesus. And that ties it down that it seems unlikely that Paul is writing completely ahistorically with this creed, because he actually has got a connection with the key early recipients of these appearances. So it looks like appearances is a historical fact we can lean on, but not that Jesus physically turned up and was with disciples, but that they had experiences that made them believe that's what had happened, that Jesus was somehow appearing to them.
Early on in my kind of doubts about the resurrection, because I had become familiar with the whole minimal facts approach and everything, but the question for me was, even if we accepted all 5 of those facts, that really doesn't get us anywhere besides the fact that the disciples found the tomb empty, which I find even that to be, like you, much more debatable than I used to, and there's not nearly as much of a consensus among scholarship as there is on some of the other facts. But if that was true, so the tomb was found empty. Grave robbery was a really common phenomenon in the first century, so much so that Rome had to write inscriptions. There's something called the Nazareth Inscription, where that warns people not to rob graves because it was such a big deal in Palestine. It was such a common phenomenon. So it seemed to me that if the disciples did find the tomb empty, that could have very reasonably been some just unknown third party necromancers, sorcerers, magicians in the first century were very famous grave robbers. They would steal bodies in order to use body parts in their magical rituals. And they really prized the bodies of saints or holy men or wonder workers, and they really prized people who died very gruesome deaths. Both of those things were very sought after. So obviously it's speculation. We could never say, but that's an entirely plausible scenario that necromancers or some other unknown third party could have stolen the body. And if Jesus ever said the kinds of things he did about suffering, about vindication after suffering, if he had an apocalyptic framework that expected a resurrection of the dead, then coming from that worldview, if the disciples did find the tomb empty after his death, and they had all of this background knowledge of Jewish expectation for resurrection, of this belief that he was the Messiah, that he had said, God will vindicate me in my cause, then it would have been very believable for them to think, let's go fast and pray and try to, ask God what happened here. It's puzzling, but it's a very suggestive puzzle. What happened to him? And of course, they're in this state of mental confusion. They're in they're dealing with grief. They're dealing with guilt over having fled. All of this situation is very ripe for having a visionary experience, having what might be called a hallucination, a projection, a mental projection of what they wanted, which was a conclusion to this horrible story. They wanted a reversal. They wanted to, for everything to turn out okay. And so it's not at all a stretch, just based on all of the literature that we have about visions of the recently deceased, and other phenomenon like that, and how common those kinds of experiences are. It's not at all a stretch to think that the disciples could have projected these visions of Jesus and then interpreted those as confirmation that God vindicated him, that he is alive, that he rose from the dead, and then that those initial experiences could have then inspired the legendary development, the very quick legendary development, as those stories spread in the early Christian community, and other people then claiming those same experiences, and that's the way legends often happen. Some saint or holy man has some experience, Francis of Assisi or something, and then that initial kind of ecstatic experience, because of the status of that saint or holy man being so revered, that becomes, just a seedbed for all sorts of fantastic, legendary accretions growing up on top of that. That seemed to me like just a very natural explanation, and I haven't seen really any good response from the apologists to explain why that shouldn't be the most natural explanation, instead of he rose from the dead.
Makes me wonder about the very, very interesting, and I wanted to bring it on soon to the what I call the doubting tradition within the Gospels. But before that, the natural assumption of Mary was not, oh, he's been raised, but we don't know. They've taken the body, and we don't know where they've laid him. Interesting response, because that is a natural response, isn't it? The body in the story there, and I think I'm not sure if that happens again in another Gospel or not, but certainly in John. And also the question of when she tells Peter, I think, and the other so-called disciple, whatever that means, and they come, and then he gets into their tomb, and he goes, and then he believed too. It's argued that that wasn't a belief in the resurrection; that was a belief that the body had gone, because then they all disappear back to their hometowns. Very strange reaction. What do you make of that?
And it contrasts strikingly with the view expressed by is it the soldiers or is it the members of the Sanhedrin, that rogue said that he would rise again after 3 days, so we better put a guard on the tomb. I mean, they were right on that. They were supposedly right there on the money with that story. If they knew about it, if they understood it, why wouldn't the disciples have understood it immediately? If it was so clear to
they all doubted, really, or lots of them did, immediately.
Well, they didn't seem to have a clue. Yeah. What outsiders fully expected from what Jesus had said was something that was just completely something that never occurred to the disciples. They were all going around setting a guard on the tomb because the disciples might go and steal the body to fulfil this 3-day prophecy. Well, the 3-day prophecy was like, completely unknown, apparently, to his own disciples.
They think the body has been taken and put in another tomb. We don't know where they're
They think, yes.
So, what do you think about that, Matthew?
I think there's a lot of questions that are kind of packed in that. But I think one of the interesting things about John's gospel, in particular, and you have that, the beloved disciple coming into the tomb and and seeing the grave clothes there, and then that's all he needed to believe. And in Luke, I think Peter comes and sees, and he marvels when he sees the inside of the tomb. But one of the interesting things about John in particular, because that is really strange that he would see and he marvel, he believes, it says he believes, and then they go to Galilee and kind of continue life as normal. Some scholars think that John 21, actually a good number of scholars think that John 21 was added later by the Johannine community after the beloved disciple's death, because it kind of talks about the way that he dies, and that there was this expectation that he would live for a long time, that he would see the return of Jesus, and seems to be kind of dealing with the cognitive dissonance over his death and how to explain that. But the added kind of feature of John 21 that's really odd is the fact that there's this appearance to Peter and the other disciples on the lake of Galilee, and in both Paul and in Luke hints at it. They all talk about the appearance to Peter as being the thing that happened first. And even in Mark, there's this suggestion when the angel or the young man at the tomb tells the women, go and tell the disciples and Peter, and it singles out Peter, that he will meet you in Galilee.
Peter's first in this list with the creed.
That,
as well.
Yes, Peter's first in Paul's list of the creed, and so it's really strange that John would have this tradition about this appearance to Peter kind of tacked on after the fact, after all of this stuff in Jerusalem. And what seems to be the case, I think the best explanation for that is it's a very common phenomenon. We were talking about harmonization earlier, but in a lot of different, I think a good example of this kind of harmonization is what the Gospel of the Ebionites does with the different narratives for the baptism of Jesus, where in some of the narratives, in the synoptic narratives of the baptism of Jesus, the voice from heaven kind of speaks out, this is my beloved son, or something to that effect. The voice from heaven, the dove comes down, people see it. And then in John's gospel, you have John saying, I heard the voice, I saw the dove, this is, it happened to me. The Gospel of the Ebionites harmonizes those two traditions by having the voice speak twice, once to the crowd and once to John. And so that kind of harmonizes it's exactly what apologists do to try and harmonize the discrepancies between the Gospels. It's a very old
original
phenomenon.
apologists.
People have been doing this. Yeah, exactly. But it seems like, I think the best explanation for John's narrative and the oddity of the disciples just going back to Galilee and continuing business as usual and fishing is that actually John is just taking the Jerusalem tradition from Luke, and then he's taking the Galilee tradition from Matthew and Mark and just harmonizing them, saying, well, let's just throw them together, and he does it very awkwardly. And so, that to me, I think, is the best explanation for why you have that really weird progression in John. I don't think that the disciples would have gone back to Galilee after that happened, and historically, it seems much more likely that they probably went back to Galilee after the crucifixion. That Peter and a few other disciples actually had these experiences in Galilee. And then because of their kind of eschatological expectation that where Jerusalem was seen as the kind of the locus, the center of God's plan for the world. Think about Deutero-Isaiah and Zechariah 12-14, all these Old Testament prophecies where Jerusalem was going to be the place where Yahweh would return, where he would set up his kingdom. It makes sense that because of that apocalyptic expectation, and them having these experiences where they believe Jesus is alive, he's coming soon, that they would then go back to Jerusalem and set up camp, set up the church in Jerusalem, and that explains why they would go back to the very place that they fled from, after the crucifixion, but and then maybe some people had some additional ecstatic visionary experiences in Jerusalem after that, and so you have these different strands of tradition. But it's essentially the reverse of Luke's or of John's chronology. Everything happens in Galilee first, and then they go to Jerusalem after that.
I believe the Gospel of Peter strikingly has them go back, like John, though, to Galilee.
He does.
To their homes, which is a very interesting one, and doesn't really seem to tap into the Luke scenario at all. So what the heck's going on, we might wonder.
It seems, Matthew, that you're seeing some kind of hallucinatory aspect to the explanation behind what we've got, particularly in this creed with that list of appearances. And a feature of hallucinations that people pick up on is how they do give you an absolutely compelling sense that the person is there. I know someone who works in an old people's home, and old people often do have hallucinations of deceased spouses, and that's a feature that really is picked up. That you can't distinguish between a hallucination of somebody and the person being there. In terms of the experience, it's not like a ghost with a sheet sort of hazy. It really is the person next to you in full physicality. So that it does. A hallucination is an excellent place to go, but the apologists keep on saying that hallucinations only ever happen on an individual basis. So we need to go somewhere else for group appearances. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in regards to the one point you made just about how there's this very common misconception that hallucinations always kind of present themselves as very ghostly figures, as kind of transparent, and that's, kind of the Hollywood, Casper kind of, just popular idea about what it would be like if you have an experience like that. But the literature, like you said, actually says very much the opposite, that very often people experience that they have these experiences of their loved ones coming to them and visiting them and speaking with them, and there's even some instances in the literature that where it's a full sensory experience. It's not just seeing, but sometimes they actually feel like they touch them and they actually have contact, and it's very much not the way that it's often caricatured as being in the apologetic kind of arguments for why that couldn't be the case. But the group appearances also, and I remember you talking about this in your response to Justin, but that's another very common misconception. And honestly, the best book that I've read on this issue is Dale Allison. He's a professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, but his book Resurrecting Jesus, he just does the best job at kind of cataloging the different arguments for and against, and is very nuanced in his approach, but he spends like 30 pages just cataloging the literature, and every page is like there's one sentence, and then the footnotes is the rest of the page, with all of the sources on the literature about visions of the recently deceased, and he shows just parallel after parallel after parallel between the literature on that phenomenon, very widespread phenomenon, and what we have in the accounts of the Gospels of the appearances of Jesus. But yeah, it's actually a very common misconception is that hallucinations can only be a personal, a private, single person phenomenon, and actually that's not the case at all. There are many reports of multiple people having these experiences together. Of course, it's the question of whether if you interview both people, and I think this probably dovetails with the point about the doubting theme in the gospel. Two people saying they saw something is not at all the same thing as being able to interview both people independently of one another and saying, okay, now tell me, what exactly did you see, and do those accounts line up? And I think that dovetails both with the doubting theme in the Gospels, and that's a very interesting thing that we can talk about, but it also dovetails with the discrepancies, how wildly different the different traditions are in each Gospel, how little correspondence there is between their narratives. Both of those facts beg the question, both of those kind of pieces of data beg the question about whether or not the kind of core historical happening that's at the root of these stories, whether it was something that was really kind of corporeal, a physical appearance of Jesus, a public appearance of Jesus. It seems there's just a lot of evidence that actually it's not nearly as physical or as public as they kind of want to say that it is.
Yeah, it's certainly on the public-private. We've been there, and it's clearly a private matter. But once you have one person believing that Jesus has returned in a very physical way, then other people having religious experiences that make me think, oh, yes, Jesus was in the room with us. it doesn't really matter if that's physical or not. It's another appearance that gets sort of added to the list.
Carl Jung, in his he did a lot of research. The psychologist Carl Jung did a lot of research in the 50s on UFO sightings, and he developed this concept that he called visionary rumors, and he talked about the way that these experiences kind of become a psychological contagion that kind of taps into a fear or just a heightened emotion of a large population, and then kind of catches on like wildfire. And he just notices kind of the very local, North American phenomenon of UFO sightings, and how that kind of tapped into this fear in the 50s about the USSR, about the atom bomb, all of this stuff, and how that made people want to imagine kind of salvation from another planet, and kind of fixing the issues, and how that was kind of the psychological explanation, but he called it visionary rumors, and I think that's a really good description for a lot of these kinds of phenomena. Sightings of the Virgin Mary is another really good example. There's a number of things like that where groups report seeing these things, but then when you interview them one-on-one, it doesn't quite work out the same.
I think that what is called, we can get onto now, the doubting tradition, as they call it, or the doubting theme, or goodness knows what. This was something that really struck me as odd. And in one sense, it actually throws a slight spanner in the works, because visions and hallucinations, things like that, is quite common, that what you saw and it seems so real. And, I was reading in one book, I think it must have been Bart Ehrman's book, and it was about that hallucinations, when people see their partner, that they recall it actually in those things as like, this was so real. This was my husband was there, I don't care what you say, he was right there, and he died 3 years before or something like that. But here we have this rather unusual contrary trend in the New Testament, which is the doubting theme. And of course, one of the classic verses is in Matthew. They go to the mountain and they see Jesus, and then it says, and some doubted. And you go, what? He's right in front of you. Is this the Jesus you thought you knew, that you were with and walking around or saw talking in groups and things, and now you're doubting? You can just imagine the conversation. He's risen again. Well, I'm not so sure. Imagine that conversation with the two of them, and he's saying, well, he doesn't quite look the same. And then the Road to Emmaus guys say, well, yeah, we didn't recognize him. We talked to him for ages, but he broke the bread, and then we saw who he was. And you're thinking, what? And then Mary says, I thought you were the gardener, and then it's suddenly Jesus. I mean, what is going on, Matthew? Tell us.
Well, that's actually another thing that in the literature on visions of the recently deceased, you would, I think that there is that intuition that people wouldn't doubt, that it would just seem so real and so convincing, but actually oftentimes there actually is a response of doubt in the literature there, and Dale Allison catalogs this, that it's not uncommon for people to actually doubt their experiences and to say, like, I mean, obviously, because that conflicts with what, you're like, well, I know they're dead. I know that they died, but I had this experience and it seemed really real. So that's not actually that uncommon. But I think the interesting thing about the doubting theme is that it kind of, it shows us that there is this alternative, that there is kind of this minority report, so to speak, that we don't actually get access to. There's a nod that some people doubted, and there were other interpretations of this event from people in the community, from disciples, that we don't actually have access to, and we only have access to the story or the stories of those who believed. Even those are very contradictory to one another. But what would it be like if we actually had a first-hand report from Thomas, or somebody else who what would that actually look like? And We don't know, because we just don't have access to that. So we have a very, very, very narrow window into what really happened, and it's only from the believers. And they say, oh, there's some people who didn't believe, but like, well, let's hear that. I mean, if we're going to actually have a full...
Well, this is exactly
some of the followers.
This is exactly what you'd expect if this was a naturalistic explanation of these events. That someone has a hallucination, we think maybe Peter, get absolutely convinced, shouts it out to all the other disciples, look, he's alive again, I've seen him himself, he was there. Then other people, we get carried away, and there are group meetings where, wow, that was amazing. And some people will get caught up with it, and some personality types will say, hang on a minute, you're all just getting carried away, and will doubt. I'd like to go right back to 1 Corinthians 15 again on this, because that was written about AD 55, we think, which is well before Mark was written, well before John, which was in the 90s, and this revelation that Matthew was just talking about, also that late. So if we go right back to 1 Corinthians 15, and this issue that Matthew picked up, that the tension between the physical Jesus and the spiritual Jesus, and this terminology, Paul talking about a fleshly body and a spiritual body, to sort of solve it. And to me, well, Paul he is very clear. He says the first man was Adam or something, and then the second was Jesus, a life-giving spirit, and that is there in 1 Corinthians 15. So no body at all, a life-giving spirit. And I see what's going on is this thing that N.T. Wright has picked up for us in that long, massive book, and that is that the Jewish understanding of resurrection was entirely physical. And yet here they were having these experiences of Jesus that seemed to be much more ethereal. Not in terms of that it doesn't feel like Jesus is there when he's appearing to you for some people, but that he comes and goes, and that he's kind of comes from heaven and appears. Because the ascension is quite a late idea. The early hymn, or whatever it's called, in Philippians 2, has Jesus go straight from death up to being ascended at God's right hand. And so it seems from the early view that Jesus is there in heaven and he comes down to appear to people. And so we have this idea from their experiences and understanding and thinking about it, that Jesus is this life-giving spirit. But then they've got to square that with the Jewish idea that Jesus is that resurrection is fully physical. And that's what Paul is trying to fix with this spiritual body talk in 1 Corinthians 15. And remembering, just say again, that this is early. This is looks like we're closer to early understanding and battles in people's minds here than all the later stuff with eating fish and all that kind of thing.
And that's very interesting too, because that connects with something that was also a very big cause for doubt early on for me, which is the fact that Paul lists his own conversion experience in the same list with, kind of tacked on to the other appearances. He says, and last of all, he appeared also to me. And that's something that, I read that early on in my doubts, and I was like, well, wait a second, like the way that Acts talks about that experience, it tells that story 3 times in Acts, and once Paul tells it, and he says, he actually calls it, I think this is Acts 26 maybe, but he calls it a heavenly vision. And then in one of the stories it says, that the people who were with him didn't see it, and they heard it, but they didn't see it. And so, and then in another place it actually reverses it. It says they saw it, but they didn't hear it. And so there's some weird things going on in the different versions of that story in Acts. But even outside of Acts, in Galatians 1, when Paul kind of recounts his conversion experience, he talks about it as a revelation, as an apocalypsis, and uses the same language that he uses elsewhere in like 2 Corinthians 12, and even in 1 Corinthians 14 when talking about visions and revelations. And so, but when he's in 1 Corinthians 15 and he's, talking about, kind of his apostleship and the kind of proof of apostleship and the reasons for that, it's then he has reason to use different language, to talk about it as an appearance of the same order as the appearances to the other apostles. But that begs the question, like, if Paul thought of his experience as a real appearance of Jesus, even though it seems like elsewhere, both in Acts and in his writings elsewhere, it was actually a visionary experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was.
Well,
it was
he actually says
internal.
he actually says in front of a local governor, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. He calls it a vision in Acts.
To the heavenly vision, exactly. Yeah.
I was going to say your point, Ed, about the idea from Paul's point of view is that Jesus could have ascended and be visiting people from heaven, as a possibility that his was post resurrection. But is there any reason to think that Paul, apart from, well, I suppose it would say how you interpret that sequence of appearances, but as Matthew says, if it's the same he appeared, there's no reason you could have it all consistent. So he appeared
absolutely.
in a similar way.
And that
otherwise you're going to say
this is a massive issue though, because it calls into question kind of the ontological nature of all of the appearances. Because if Paul could have said that this was an appearance and it was in the same, of the same substance, it was the same stuff as the appearances to the other apostles, it gave him the same authority that it gave them, then who's to say that their experiences weren't all visionary as well?
That's
and
right.
that to me, I mean, especially considering that Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, like we said, is the earliest testimony that we have to any of this stuff, and the fact that Paul is actually the only first-hand eyewitness to an appearance of the risen Jesus that we have in the whole New Testament.
Yeah.
All of the other stuff in the Gospels is all secondary.
Paul writes about his experience only once, and that is he gives the story of his life early in Galatians, and instead of saying Jesus spoke to me and I was on the road to Damascus, he says that Jesus revealed himself in me. Not all English translations have it in me, but
it's different.
Loads of
variations,
them do.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to interpret that as anything other than a religious experience or an internal experience, rather than Jesus actually standing next to him in what he feels is a full physicality.
Can we move on to some of these more we talked about at the beginning, things like I've always struggled with this. When you see on YouTube, if you type in resurrection debate, you will get, as you know, Matthew, Ed, Francis, stacks of debates on the resurrection. I would love to see a debate on the ascension. I would just love to see it, because it's not that I know what, like, I've talked to John, who we interviewed on here before, and what the ascension for him, as I mentioned, I think in episode 2, he said the ascension he believes creedally.
Yeah.
But not in the same historical level as the resurrection. But the thing is, for me, from a Christian point of view, evangelical point of view, conservative point of view, the ascension would be just as historically real with a video camera, according to Acts, as the resurrection. Now, historical evidence is very different because you've just got it in Acts. But the fact is, this is part of, to me, I can't see them separated. You have if you had a resurrection that's totally real, and then Jesus living somewhere in, I don't know, South Jerusalem to this day, he's got to have ascended in a physical way, according to Luke. So, Matthew, what do you think about the fact that this isn't really addressed in apologetics?
I think that the ascension is just pretty obviously one of the more embarrassing features of the gospel record. I think for a lot of reasons, but I think one of the big reasons why modern scholars don't really talk about the ascension at all in kind of arguing for the historicity of the resurrection is both because of what we talked about in terms of just the how convenient of an explanation, how kind of ad hoc it is. and the fact that there isn't multiple attestation for the resurrection narrative. It's just Luke. Luke is the only one who gives that narrative. And also the narrative is kind of overlaid with these features from Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, both passages that were very popular in the early church, and look similar in some ways to the ascension of Elijah in Kings, which is something that in literary terms Luke actually relies a lot on language from the narratives of Elijah and Kings. But another reason I think is just because of how embarrassing the cosmology is to a modern frame of mind, because it seems like Luke very kind of uncritically accepts the common ancient view of the world, that hell is below our feet, heaven is above our heads, and it's kind of that three-storied universe of the ancient world. And Jesus, when he goes to heaven, that he doesn't just disappear; he ascends to heaven because heaven is up there. And that was a big, that was the foundation for Rudolf Bultmann's, if you read his Kerygma and Myth, his whole project of demythologizing the New Testament was kind of built on that premise of just recognizing that the New Testament is so filled with mythology, and that is most evident especially in that three-storied universe that is just so foreign to our understanding of the cosmos today, that you can't really accept that, and so you have to just discard it. But if you discard the ascension, what does that mean for everything else? And it becomes a domino effect, because ascension,
exactly.
Parousia, Second Coming, and resurrection, they all fit together very tightly as this very clear sequence. And if you take one thing out of that sequence, what does that do for everything else? So I think those are some reasons why you don't see apologists really talking about the ascension at all, because it just, at every point, from every direction that you look at it, it's just really embarrassing.
Well, I think that really should. That really is a great point to actually end such a fantastic interview, basically, Matthew. I just want to thank you so much for such input.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, in
thank you,
any
guys.
areas here. So, Ed, you just want to do a sort of little final comment, and then I'll close.
Well, it's just been a privilege to learn from you. I've looked into this stuff quite a lot, and I've certainly learned from you today. It was brilliant for me. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been absolutely terrific. So, thank you again then, Matthew. And I was going to say, when you first quoted N.T. Wright, I prefer Bob Price's argument that he's N.T. wrong. And so we just want to thank you again, having the Apostle Matthew on. Sorry, the disciple Matthew to follow John. No, you know what I mean. But anyway, so thanks very much for being on this bonus episode. So I hope all you listeners out there, of which we know Matthew is one, so we just need to know if there's some more with evidence. Okay, thanks very much.
Cheers.